Welcome to Lesson 4 on the road to the Civil War. Today we're going to be talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so this would reference page 6 of your notes. Now, when we're talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the one main figure that you need to remember is Stephen Douglas. He is really pushing to make a lot of changes to what had become traditional agreements between the North and the South. He did so because he was looking to gain votes in the South in his run to become president. So he was doing some things that would favor the South. He was also looking to make a railroad that would go through his home state of Illinois in order to gain some business there. So for those two reasons, Stephen Douglas begins to push for a transcontinental railroad. But in order to get the transcontinental railroad completed, he wants to have Kansas organized as a state. If Kansas became a state, it would probably, under his plan, become a slave state, and then Nebraska would enter the Union with it as its partner pair as a free state. The problem with this plan, though, is that all of Kansas and all of Nebraska are north of the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel line of latitude, which was the Missouri Compromise line. If Kansas were to enter the Union as a slave state, yet be north of this line, then that meant that we could throw out the entire Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery from spreading in northern territories. This is what Stephen Douglas had to do in order to get this plan passed. He had to try and get the Southerners on his side in order to get the railroad to be completed. And so he pushes for the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, he was a great public speaker. He was able to win a lot of people over to his side. But even though Northerners were against the spread of slavery in the North, they saw what business opportunities could come from this railroad having this northern track to it. And so, in the interest of profitable businesses, a lot of northern congressmen voted for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially ended the Missouri Compromise. The people of the North were furious about this. They saw the Missouri Compromise as almost something sacrosanct, that you couldn't touch it. This was an agreement that they had lived under now for more than 30 years, and it was something important to them to have that security to know that slavery wasn't going to expand into the North. What a lot of Northerners felt was if slavery could expand into the northern territories, then why couldn't slavery expand into northern states? And before you know it, you would be living down the street from a slave owner. And so the northern people were really against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but it had already passed. So their solution was, what they were going to do was, according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it wasn't certain that Kansas was going to be a slave state or that Nebraska was going to be a free state. Instead, these areas would be open to popular sovereignty, which meant that the people who lived in that territory could vote as to whether the territory was going to become a free state or a slave state. So what they decided to do was have a whole bunch of people who were against slavery move into what would become the state of Kansas, and then when the vote occurred as to whether they were going to be a free state or a slave state, they would vote for Kansas to become a free state. So a bunch of abolitionists and a bunch of people who are against slavery move into the Kansas territory before the vote occurred. Southerners found out that this was happening, and they were furious because they voted to have a railroad go through these northern territories and into the northern states because in exchange for that, they believed that they were going to be guaranteed Kansas, a slave state, to enter the Union with them. This would return the balance that was upset when California entered as a free state, and so this would return the balance to the Senate, and they would be able to expand slavery into some more territories. So when a bunch of abolitionists are moving into Kansas, this makes the Southerners very unhappy. Stephen Douglas was a Democrat, and Northern Democrats were angry at him for essentially junking the Missouri Compromise. Southern Democrats were angry at the Northerners for trying to go behind their back and not allow slavery to enter into Kansas. And so the Democratic Party at this point in 1854 also breaks apart. And so, as we saw earlier from the Whig Party, the issue of slavery is now dividing the political parties. With the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the real implications were that the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and now the Compromise of 1850 were both essentially thrown out the window. If you were going to have popular sovereignty everywhere, then that meant that anybody could expand into a slave state. That meant that you could essentially have slavery anywhere. And so those limitations that were passed in those two compromises were gone. And so this opened up the entire country. Essentially, what they thought was to open up the entire country in order to have slaves there. In response to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the death of the Whig Party, we have a new political party being formed, the Republican Party. It took all of the people who were against slavery and against the expansion of slavery in the territories, so former Whigs, Northern Democrats, people who were part of the Free Soil Party, people who were part of the Know Nothing Party, everybody who was against the expansion of slavery in the territories essentially formed into this new Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln, who was against slavery, he was against the expansion of slavery. He joins the new Republican Party and he runs for the Senate against Stephen Douglas of Illinois. The debates that they have are known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and these debates become very famous because Stephen Douglas is essentially pushing for popular sovereignty. People at this point didn't want to confront the slavery issue head on, and so they voted for Stephen Douglas for the Senate. People around the rest of the country, though, heard about this great guy, Abraham Lincoln, who was vehemently against the expansion of slavery, and so when he runs for president in 1860, they remember those debates, and it will actually help him to win the presidency against one of his Democratic opponents, Stephen Douglas. So this election cost Abraham Lincoln the Senate seat, but it ended up winning him the presidency later on. The Kansas-Nebraska Act can be seen as a short-term cause of the Civil War. So on your war charts, you can put in Kansas-Nebraska Act for a short-term cause of the Civil War. Also, we can talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written in 1852. Her book makes an emotional and moral appeal against slavery. It talks about how awful slavery was, and it was inspired by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. It became a very, very popular book. Many people had this book. It sold over 2 million copies in a decade. So within 10 years, 2 million people had copies of this book. It was popular in Europe. Britain and France bought quite a lot of copies. And in fact, it was so popular and encouraged so many people to be against slavery that Abraham Lincoln, when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War, he says, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." And so the Uncle Tom's Cabin can be seen as another short-term cause of the Civil War. The South hated this book because they felt like it was going to turn a lot of people against the institution of slavery who were neutral to begin with. Now people who were religious were going to be against slavery, and people who hated how the slaves were treated were turned against slavery as well. And so that concludes this lesson. You can go ahead and give an attempt to the quiz.